females are different to males. Like males, hormones are, steady, consistent every month. Females, you have fluctuating hormone, progesterone, estrogen every single month. And for every player, it's different. It's not like it's the same for every female. Obviously, if it was, that would be easier.
Welcome to VALDCAST. Don, welcome.
Hey Ryan, nice to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
No problem at all. It's great to be here. We're at the Red Bull Athlete Performance Center for our first ever VALDCon X in LA. How's the day one been so far?
Yeah, it's been fantastic. I mean, first and foremost, I lived in LA for 10 years and I've never been to the Red Bull facility. So that alone, and then the day yesterday was incredible. From, I think, like the opening from Sam, Laurie and Chris. I actually, ashamedly, maybe just hadn't realised their journey or story. I actually started working like in 2016 with some of your products, and I hadn't realised the journey, that it was kind of those three guys who kind of created it all. So it was really cool to hear that yesterday. And then, obviously, then you had Dan Cohen and Matt Taberner present an amazing kind of talk, which was incredible. But I just think they were all great, but also just the opportunity to interact with other people and see some of the product updates. Again, I've used the products for 10 years, so to see some of the latest updates and kind of newer products was fantastic as well. So yeah, it's been great so far and excited for today.
For sure. I'm excited to have you on VALDCAST as well and dive into what is a decorated career, I think is a humble way to describe it. But let's just jump into things, Don. So before we dive into some of the specific teams and organizations you've been involved with, do you want to just give a 30-second intro to who Don Scott is?
Yeah, sure. I'm from the northeast of England. Grew up, I know I don't look this old, in the 70s. At that time, it wasn't really an opportunity for girls to play football. So I just played football in the street with the boys. Eventually, after two other kind of tries, found sports science as a degree. So I did a degree in sports science, did a master's in sports nutrition, actually lectured for 3.5 years, because even at the end of that, in the 90s, there wasn't really any roles in sport, and I didn't really know what a sports scientist was. So I lectured for 3 and a bit years and did a bit of voluntary work in women's football, fitness testing, programming, etc. And then a role came up at the English Football Association to work with the England women's football team with Hope Powell. So I applied and was very fortunate to get the opportunity in 2001 to start working with the England women's national team.
Amazing. I think we'll start there for the purpose of this conversation. I know there's the US side of things as well, which was obviously a great run. But let's go back to 2001 when you jumped in. What was the state of the industry like? And maybe that's sports science, but also the female game.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been incredible, the transition over the last 25 years, generational change, but also fund and investment. Back then, it was all amateur, like the players were working full time as post people, teachers in the police, etc. And then it was really introducing and starting a sports science support program with the team. Like I always remember my first camp and thinking, like, what's my role? Like a physio, a doctor, you kind of know because they're preparing the players for training or recovering them after. But as a sports scientist, I was just observing the first few days. And then it's like, oh, okay, I can help with the warm up, or what's the nutrition like for the players after, what recovery they're doing, etc. What's actually the load in training? Because again, back then, technology, GPS wasn't a thing. VALD systems were not out there in the early 2000s. And it was also a lot of education of the players of they were working full time and then you were trying to top up with training to increase their physical kind of fitness levels so that we could compete kind of on the world stage. So yeah, that was a real time when there was limited resource, limited technology out there, and you almost had to be kind of creative and think out the box at times.
So when you're looking to get like a basic picture of load, which is a funny term as well, but how did that happen? Was it heart rate monitors or was it mainly subjective?
Yeah, so kind of subjective RPEs, so simple paper pencil collecting those, but then also a big thing was the heart rate watches that we gave every player. Heart rate watch, some called it their personal trainer. We would set their heart rate zones in it. And so now back home, they could train, kind of intermittent rather than just kind of slow, continuous, which some of them did, just no fault of their own, just they didn't know any different. So yeah, like they became their kind of personal trainers. And it wasn't really until towards the end of my time with England, 2008-9, when GPS technology came in, which was a much bigger kind of system. Even back then, like using, the jump mats for kind of jump height. And you look back again at some of the reliability or lack of those products back then. But again, that was all that was out there.
For sure. That's great. I think I want to touch a bit on resources and, the female game. It's been publicized, especially back then. It would have been an uphill battle for the gym and the environment that you were training in. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was an uphill battle. I would say Hope Powell, being the England manager, was a massive kind of driver advocate for women's football. She would be at the boardroom level fighting older white men in suits to get funding, and eventually she did. She got funding for players to get centralised contracts, but again, back then you're talking about like £6,000 a year, so it's not like like they're millionaires. And then the other piece was with the players, we want them to get stronger. And obviously, to get stronger, you want to have supervised sessions to make sure technique, etc. And part of the challenge again back then was who could supervise the players, and so we did some kind of centralized training of kind of Olympic lifting with the players to start some of that process. And actually, we identified 3 pockets of players, a group in the northeast in Sunderland, a group in Liverpool, and a group in London. And the best qualified people at the time to supervise the players and who had facilities were some of the prison officer personal trainers who worked in the prisons. And so we had pockets of players in those 3 locations who would meet 1 to 2 times a week and go in together, get escorted through to the gym, do their work with somebody who was qualified, supervised to do it, and then they'd come out and be free again. So
bizarre things. And I was saying to you before this as well, like I did a quick Wikipedia search, and that's one of the top things about Don Scott that pops up. So that's interesting. Were you involved in that? Would you be actively going into the prison to be in the sessions, or was it strictly here's your program, girls, go on?
I wasn't, obviously, because I was kind of central at that time. The English FA was based out of Lilleshall in Shropshire. So that's kind of where I was based. I would go in, kind of visit, but I didn't go every week just purely because of that travel and geography. But for me, you always want to go and check the environment and make sure it is kind of safe and feasible, because obviously that is challenging, but it was the best way to do it. And probably at that time, again, the most qualified people that we could find who we believe could kind of work with the players. So in terms of like the programs, yes, I would set them, but I would also continue the communication with the player and the trainers who were working with the players to make sure either individuals were progressing appropriately or the program was appropriate for those individuals as well.
Okay, awesome. That's an interesting road. I didn't think I would go down. Cool. So that brings us to 2009, 2010.
Yeah.
Transition, was it straight from the FA to the US women's national team?
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Early 2009. So Pia Sundhag, the Swedish coach who was the head coach of the US women at the time, she had a sports scientist working with her at the time, Helena Andersson from Sweden, who was probably one of the only other kind of few females kind of working in applied sports science in football. So we were kind of in touch, and I knew about her research, etc. And she was only ever part-time with the US team. The US won the Olympics in 2008, the gold medal. And then after that, they were looking to kind of bring in a full-time as fitness coach is the term they used it, which, that can mean many things. Helena, excuse me, wasn't interested in a full-time role, so she kind of recommended me to Pia. So really, Pia sent an email kind of early 2009, said, who she was and that they might be getting a full-time role. And, for me at that time, I had been very, very fortunate to actually be on holiday in the US in 1999, and a friend had a ticket for a match which happened to be the Women's World Cup final at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena. So I went to the game. And also at that time in 99, like you look in England, like media coverage of, I didn't even know England had a women's football team because of, so you come here and you see it. And I think it just added an extra kind of light bulb to me in terms of like, wow, like this is incredible. 92,000 fans in the Rose Bowl. So I'd been fortunate to go to that game. So, like Pia reaches out, it's the number 1 team in the world. I actually had exchanges with Pia for about 5-6 months until eventually she said, yes, we're going to have a role. And at that point, I spoke to Hope Powell about it because, again, I'd been with England for about 9 years. And, I think as a practitioner, I think sometimes there's like a ceiling and a shelf life of, I had introduced it from the start. Again, you not become stuck in your processes, but I think sometimes, especially like in the women's game where you're doing it as one person, like you're literally a generalist doing everything from nutrition recovery to the whole sports science of train load monitoring, education, gym work, etc. So one, it's it's exhausting. Like, let's not kind of forget that as well for the new practitioners coming in. But also I just felt like for the players as well, probably a new voice coming in, and for me myself personally, a new challenge. So spoke it through with Hope, and she's like, you should explore it. And then, eventually by the end of 2009, Pia was like, okay, this is the role. It was a big salary reduction. I always remember my dad saying, well, no, you can't take that. It's too much. But I was like, gosh, it's like, what an opportunity, number one. And I remember the last conversation with Pia, she was like, it's not always about the money, it's about the journey. And literally kind of next day I signed and carried a couple of suitcases across to the US, out to LA, and spent 10 years.
The rest is history, yeah. So as far as like major successes, I know there's an Olympic in there. There's two World Cups. Yeah. Not a bad track record for sure. But if we start off from like the start of your journey with the US women's national team, the state of, I guess, the female game and the environment you were in all the way to the end, and with a bit of a skew towards technology, testing, how you got insights into your players. Can you talk through that, and maybe from that first year all the way to when you left? Because I feel like the advancements in GPS, it was around 2013, 14 when GPS became, a necessity, maybe, rather than just a nice to have. But talk me through, how did that go? How did you get insights into your athletes, and how did you develop them?
Yeah, I mean, obviously coming in, like the US was the number one team in the world. And so, they'd been trailblazers, the 85ers who started the team, the 99ers who won the second gold medal. So again, came in and physically they were dominant. I would say when I came in, it wasn't really scientific in terms of the processes, and also some of the recovery and things off the pitch were, for me, suboptimal. So it was really like, I remember the first ever camp was doing an education session with the team on what is sports science, what does it mean, how can it help you, what are the different areas. And I always remember whenever I did something like that, the players would go away and search on the internet and then come back and ask, a lot of questions. And, obviously on the internet, there's misinformation, disinformation. So, again, some of that was clarity, but it was also a good challenge for me of check and challenge myself. And then, again, initially it was introducing heart rate, kind of tracking, RP, kind of paper pencil methods, because again, some of that wasn't happening. And then, the nutrition, looking at kind of the food, the menus. And then, again, the other thing about the US, they had two other professional leagues which didn't kind of last until the NWSL, the National Women's Soccer League, came in 2013. So outside of the national team, the players were in mixed environments. And even when the NWSL came in 2013, most clubs had maybe one full-time head coach and maybe one or two staff who did kind of everything else. And so no specialists really on the fitness kind of realm. So then in 2012, going to the Olympics in England, the London Olympics, through the US Olympic Committee, we basically bid in and got funding to get a GPS system. So that was kind of first time of using that. Then started even more scientific, kind of, almost benchmarking match loads for players, different formations, different systems, different positions, and then looking at, obviously train loads, etc. But obviously everything contextual. And then 2015, in Canada, won the World Cup. And after that, Jay Berhalter, who was a US soccer, he was a massive kind of advocate of the whole kind of sports science performance side. And so, managed to get a big advocate in him for the kind of sports science. And we basically in 2016 introduced a sports science support across the whole NWSL, where myself and Julian Haig, who's here as well, we did education, we did support. US Soccer at that time owned the league, so we brought in, GPS monitoring across the whole league. We brought in wellness monitoring, and then at that time, VALD started bringing out some of their kind of first products, like the Nord board, the groin bar, which obviously is now the Force frame, and then the Force deck. So we introduced that with the US Women's National Team, but obviously, the players are only with the national team for so long. Like their bread and butter, if you like, is mainly in their kind of club environment, and they're there all the time. So it was, how can we provide similar with a national team in the club? So every year myself and Julian would go out on the road and take the equipment with us and profile the players and then give that information back to the clubs. But then when the national team players came in with the US, we'd obviously continue some of that monitoring. And then eventually, now many of the NWSL clubs have their own systems and products and, can kind of do that themselves. But all the time it was like, I'm a big kind of proponent of like the individual lens, the individual player, everything about the individual, a strength program might work for one player but not the other, so how can you fine tune it to that player? And also, what are the physical match demands, what's their environment, what's their club, what staffing have they got, etc. And even the kind of psychology, nutrition side of things. So again, it's for me putting everything around the player. And then the added element around 2018, 19 was then the female lens as well of, impact of hormones, menstrual cycle, sex differences, as well as like some of the gendered and societal considerations. So, it was again, I look at that time, and it was fascinating yesterday, again, just hearing like Sam, Laurie, Chris talk about, the start of VALD. And I don't think I'd fully appreciated like almost my evolution alongside it with the women's national team and the NWSL, and how we brought those products in and started using that really to fine-tune training and support for the players.
I think it's really refreshing even just to see where the female game is at, and obviously there's so much more room for evolution, but the NWSL, from my experience at least, we've got a decent handful of clients now that are regular VALD users, never mind the US women's national team as well. So I want to go into maybe two things here now. The first one is the point you made about yourself and Julian going on the road, bringing the technology with you. How did you go about choosing what tests, what metrics to do? And I know you just alluded to like the individualness of the athletes, but I'm sure you can't be fully individual when you go on the road and you want to profile X amount of players. So how did you go about that? And my second question then will be diving more into the female lens, but we'll stick with the technology first.
Yeah. I think it was looking at obviously physical match demands, and then what do we need to measure to, again, all of that information feedback went back to the clubs for them to then implement, whatever they felt was appropriate. Although, with any US women's national team players, there was a, kind of two-way input there. But it was looking at, okay, what time have we got? How many players? How can we maximize that time? So we kind of came up eventually with a protocol of a submaximal warm-up kind of running, so that we knew the kind of external load was the same all the time. So you get the heart rate on, so now you see the internal load of that. After that, again, we used the smart speed timing gates to do sprint testing. I would say I've probably evolved since then, because again, at that time we did splits, every 5 meters. And for me, I think there's so much impact, like some of those. I think one thing as well we always did was tested indoors on turf. So we tried to control, because we were literally traveling from Seattle, Portland, Houston, Chicago, East Coast, Orlando. So, if we just got somewhere outdoors, then you're not kind of controlling any of the environment or the surface things. So every environment we indoors on turf. So at least we tried to control that piece. So then, speed testing, and then literally with the VALD equipment. And again, at that time, I remember even the Nord board, there wasn't really a travel case for that. So our equipment guy he got a big hockey bag, and literally we crossed our fingers that it would arrive in one piece, and, we could kind of bounce up and set up and kind of go. So we'd then do a almost, kind of three-way thing of the Nord board, so kind of straightforward Nordic, the force frame, so adduction, abduction, and then the the force plate testing, the force decks. So I'd say with the force decks, again, we were probably naive initially where, we did some single leg jumping, but I think from doing that, you just realise some players not comfortable doing it, familiarity, technique, etc. So then we almost standardised it and just did a squat jump and a counter movement with kind of arms fixed, yeah. So yeah, we kind of like landed on there. I'd say even then, kind of back then, like the metrics, we were probably very basic in the metrics that we use. So again, listening to Dan Cohen and Matt Taberner yesterday, like delving into a lot of them, for me, I was like, wow, like we didn't have that kind of resource or even probably that insight back then, like 2016 to 19, where again, it was kind of a new product and, you're probably just looking at some of the basic metrics of everything that's in there. Looked a little bit at some of the imbalances. So again, like interesting hearing yesterday of like, not just focusing on the imbalance, obviously the absolute numbers and the imbalance. And again, that's kind of where we got to. And then the last thing we did was a kind of endurance test. And again, we varied from doing like a yo-yo intermittent recovery test to a 30-15 kind of test. Again, it was what can we give back to the clubs that would be beneficial for them? So actually in the end, we went with a 30-15 test. So again, they could do some MAS, maximal aerobic speed kind of prescription, like HIIT training on the back of that. But even that at times was a challenge to get a facility that was long enough inside for that 40 meter the kind of 40 meters of the 30-15. And all the time it was wearing the GPS, wearing the heart rate. So again, we could track that, give that back to the clubs and then kind of work with them. Like again, Julian Haig built out Power BI dashboards to pull the data in. And, some of it was cool to see like the progress of some of those players across the 3-4 years that we did it. Again, I just kind of look back and wish we'd been in there longer term to kind of continue that on over, a number of years. I think it's a very different scenario now where obviously the NWSL owns the NWSL and the investment from the owners. I'm not sure we'll get that kind of integration of some of that data and that shared data kind of moving forward. And, it's a shame because as one club, you can only monitor and do so much in terms of kind of the amount of data.
It's the politics of sport as well. Okay, so maybe before we jump onto the female, I've got one question on, you mentioned like all the tests and the progress you saw. Did you ever get to the point where you had almost a threshold where you could tell that, this athlete is obviously a very good athlete at their club, but now they're at the level that physically at least they could move into the women's national team?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I guess it's an interesting one because I think obviously as well, like the physical data is only one part of it. So, you look at some players who technically, tactically incredible, but maybe physically didn't score so well, as for want of a better word, but they're never not going to get picked because of the qualities that they bring in that respect. And then you have other players who they need to improve that kind of physical. I think about like say a Lindsay Horan, Mallory Swanson coming through who were younger players and, just their training age was so different to say a Becky Sauerbrunn or, a Megan Rapinoe. So again, it's applying what's needed for those individual players at different times. So I think in terms of like physical match demands, there was a clear difference between club and national team. So I'd say rather than maybe the gym work being focused on those differences, some of it was some of the loading on the pitch, on the field. And I feel like females anyway, like being strong, getting stronger is so important for injury reduction, injury prevention to then ultimately help kind of performance optimization.
You can't go wrong getting strong. Yeah, no, I think I asked that question because a lot of coaches now that are coming in and they're fresh, they want norms, and we spoke about normative data here and we spoke about all that, but engage with caution. I think when there's so many other factors at play, it's not just about the physical. So that's good. And maybe moving on with that line of thinking, the female athlete, it's became more and more topical. There's more research on it in the last probably 5 years or so. So talk me through the differences that you need to be aware of when you start working with elite female athletes, because it's not a copy and paste.
No, it's absolutely not a copy and paste. And I think it's hard because yes, there is an increasing amount of research, but I don't think right now there's not enough evidence to say, performance or recovery is impacted by menstrual cycle or hormones. again, even though research is increasing, it's going to take time to translate that research. And that can be 10, 12, 17 years. It's kind of a long time to get that translation. Also, in terms of research, like the quality of the research, it also costs to do the research if you want to take into account hormones and menstrual cycle and etc. So, I think there is a dearth, like we do need to do more, and we need to commit to doing that so that we can get those insights for our female players. So I think we also need to be careful when we are making recommendations or making interventions based on kind of menstrual cycle and hormones, because again, the evidence is not there currently. However, females are different to males. Like males, hormones are, steady, consistent every month. Females, you have fluctuating hormone, progesterone, estrogen every single month, and for every player it's different. It's not like it's the same for every female. Obviously, if it was, that would be easier. So first and foremost for me is education, normalizing the conversation, starting the conversation. And that's with the players, but also with practitioners, coaches, the whole ecosystem around a club, so that it becomes a normal conversation kind of every single day. And then I think tracking and monitoring the individual kind of player athlete. You don't know what you don't know. So again, I've heard some people say, well, if they don't think it's, kind of an issue for them, then just leave it. Well, if they're not tracking, they don't really know. So, I've worked with players who say, now that I've tracked, I kind of realize it at certain time stages, I'm seeing this happening. And then I think it's just, again, providing support around the individual player of, looking at some of their menstrual cycle symptoms, severity. Again, a menstrual cycle is a sign of like a healthy body. If a cycle is suddenly longer or shorter, it suggests that there's some kind of imbalance and stress in the body. Or, if the bleed phase is longer or shorter or more painful or not, or symptoms are more severe, it again suggests that there's an imbalance of stress, whether that's, travel, training load, underfueling, lack of recovery, etc. So again, it's building a safe environment where a player feels like they can have that conversation and, be open with how they're feeling, and then supporting that individual player around that. But then I do think with our monitoring systems, we need to have an idea of, where a player is, like in terms of their menstrual cycle status and, kind of whether it's phase or stage of the cycle. I know, I think there's mixed thinking of whether you should define phases. There are kind of discrete parts of the menstrual cycle from, the period, the bleed phase, ovulation. So again, that kind of first phase is follicular, and then the second phase is almost the luteal phase. And even the luteal phase, you almost have like the part from post-ovulation until 3 to 4 days before the onset of the next period menstrual cycle. And it's those 3 or 4 days before the start of the next cycle when most players seem to have kind of most symptoms and most severity. But again, it's not one size fits all. I've had some players who track and monitor and they have and feel nothing and they have regular cycles, others who have quite severe symptoms. And so then it's how can you support those individuals to make sure they're available every single day and, that they can still perform on every single day, because that is the aim, not to restrict somebody from training or match availability.
For sure. And it's a nice point that we have phases in the research, but there's other factors. I think from athletes I've been involved with, PCOS pops up. We won't dive into that on VALDCAST maybe, but the question I have based off that is the female athlete triad, or REDS as it's more effectively known now. When you were with the US women's national team, did you see that, over time, maybe the incidence rate of those female athlete triad affected athletes has decreased with education, or is it still similar?
Yeah, I think the term now used is low energy availability. So that's kind of almost the kind of updated term. I think sometimes in those situations, it happens with players because they don't know like what they should be eating and when and how much. And so I think there's that part of it. And obviously, with low energy availability or low nutrition intake, that is going to impact the menstrual cycle. And so again, either missed cycles or short or longer. So I think really, I would say across my 25 years, just like the education and knowledge sharing now is so impactful and so powerful. But I think what we must remember is that the younger generation coming through, they might think they know everything, but we still need to educate those younger players. Like, you know, there is generational change. You know, my generation is very different to the younger generation now, but you also have, you know, players like Jess Fishlock, who, you know, is kind of mid-30s, who has had a real extensive career, and she has a different lens to maybe some of those younger players at her club, Seattle Reign. So again, it's for me, education is really key in that context, and the whole time is putting that whole multidisciplinary team support around a player, because a report by FIFA, the benchmarking report this year, where they survey all member associations, again shows that less than 50% of female players have access to nutrition, psychology, sports science, S&C. And again, when you think about the importance of those for an athlete generally, but especially the female athlete, you know, that is where, yes, the women's game is evolving at such a rapid rate, but are the environments evolving at the same pace, and are they optimal for those players? Because what we do also see is that in women's sport, there's now more roles, more opportunities, especially on the performance side. There's higher salaries. We're seeing more male practitioners and more male practitioners coming from men's sport who apply the lens they've used in men's sport. So, you know, I think first and foremost, if a practitioner is coming from men's sport, you need to understand the environment for the female, and, you know, what the female experiences, and, you know, the whole kind of female athlete health. And, you know, even myself, like I did STEM subjects growing up, and female physiology wasn't my strength. So I had to upskill and learn myself, and I still learn and absorb from, you know, I've got way smarter people around me who I absorb information from, because I don't know it all. But I feel like practitioners now coming from men's sport, it's important that you know the landscape, you know those players. You don't just throw everything at those players, you educate them and you support them, but you do everything also with the female lens, because even beyond like the sex differences, you've got the gendered factors of, you know, growing up, most females don't have an environment or support, or they're in a voluntary environment, so their training age is different, and, you know, societal factors, or females want to please more, and so they just kind of get on with it and maybe put aside like menstrual cycle or symptoms, etc. So again, it's having that awareness and really building relationships in a safe environment for players.
Sure. I think in the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes, I've learned loads as well there. So that's been really impactful. That's great. So I think we'll wrap things up now. But before we do, I always like to throw a few kind of curveballs at our guests. It's nothing crazy, but based off today, or well, today's just starting, but yesterday as well. And, you know, we talk about the state of the industry, VALD, the technology, the evolutions, things that are coming up. What do you see as the biggest opportunity for practitioners in the next, you know, let's say the next 4-year cycle?
Gosh. I mean, being selfish about women's sport, I think seeing VALD now, like in your platform where you can pull everything into one dashboard, is incredible. I think always overlaying the female lens. So again, having an appreciation of, you know, menstrual cycle status of your players and kind of where they're at, and how that overlays with some of that performance data that you're tracking and monitoring. And even, again, within some of that, like if you're profiling players, do you know where a player is in their cycle? Because again, depending on where they are from day 1 to 28 of that typical cycle, they're potentially going to perform very differently. So for me, I think all the time overlaying that female lens and the players and the athletes that you're supporting.
Awesome. I like that a lot. I think that'll be product feedback for the guys as well. Cool. So Don, if people want to reach out from listening to this, where's the best place to hit you up?
I did launch my own business towards the end of last year. So my website is dawnscottepc.com. So yeah, reach out there, or I'm also on LinkedIn, which I think I'm just Dawn Scott. I don't do much on social media other than that, unfortunately, kind of come off that at different times. But yeah, so LinkedIn or kind of the website, the business.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for the talk today and the contribution, and hopefully we've got another jam-packed day of VALDCon events.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on, and look forward to today. Thank you. Thanks.